Senator Conrad and members of the Budget Committee, I'm Bob McIntyre, and I direct Citizens for Tax Justice, which is a tax policy and research group that fights for a fair tax system for middle-income families all over the country, federal, state, and local. And I've been doing this for 30 years, so I must not be very good at it, based on where we are now. Okay. Today we're talking about something that is an important piece of our tax puzzle, and that's the fact that we aren't collecting taxes from a lot of people who should be paying them. Now you can look, Senator Conrad pointed out how serious our budget deficit problem is, how much we've been borrowing. In fact, over the last 5 years, we have funded 25% of our federal budget outside of Social Security with borrowed money, which is just staggering. And that after balanced budgets in the years before that. We know why that's happened. Income tax revenues have gone through the floor. They were more than 10% of the GDP in fiscal 2000. They've averaged 7.3% over the last 5 years, which is a 28% drop. Now we've had a minor improvement lately. They're only 25% below where they were in fiscal 2000. And that's the problem. Now, we're not going to solve that problem while George Bush is president, because he would veto any attempt to repeal his tax cuts. We know that. But Republicans and Democrats and President Bush, a Republican, must be able to agree that we ought to collect the taxes that are due, that people who are cheating on their taxes should not be allowed to do it. If we can't agree on that, my. So what can we do? Well, let's talk about the tax gap, the nature of it. You know, the IRS has a figure. It's not a very reliable figure. It's based on very old data or very incomplete research. They say the net figure of about $300 billion after they've collected 50 or so from catching people. But it's bigger than that, in my view, because they don't count all this offshore tax dodging because they don't know about it, all these corporate tax sheltering deals because they don't know about them or don't know enough about them to measure it. So it's really an even bigger figure than that. And those are the things that are doing the most damage right now to our tax system, in my view. And that's what my testimony focuses on, and that's what I want to focus on in my few minutes today. Now, as Senator Conrad pointed out, we have a country of honest wage earners. They pay their taxes. Maybe not because they're morally superior, but maybe because their taxes are known to the IRS. Their income is known to the IRS. There's information, there's withholding, and that works. But when you get the kinds of income that the IRS doesn't know about, whether it's capital gains or business profits, that there is no paper trail that goes to the IRS, then we have a problem. And the people who have these kinds of income, they're not all a bunch of crooks. Some are. But they need help, both sides. They need our help to pay their taxes honestly and be good, patriotic Americans like I'm sure they all want to be. So, how can we help them? Well, we need to get rid of the secrecy as much as possible so that there is a paper trail to the IRS, that the IRS knows about these kinds of income. You can do some of it with 1099s. You can do some of it with agreements with other countries, which is a huge problem, so we get information from them. And we have a long list in our testimony of things like that get into that area. We also need to clarify the law. You know, we have laws against most of these offshore tax cheating activities. But arguably, they're not completely clear. And if you're a lawyer, everything's arguable. I went to law school, too. We need to make it completely clear so that people don't have a leg to stand on when they get into these deals. And that means that the people who are advising them, the lawyers, the accountants, the investment bankers, will be in serious trouble if they help them out in these schemes. So clarification is a good thing. And penalties would be a good thing. I know we've been increasing penalties. They're obviously not enough. The chances of being caught are so low that penalties on the advisors even more penalties would be a good idea. And finally, we need to give the IRS the resources it needs. The IRS has been cut back and cut back and cut back, so now the number of people who are devoted to examinations are down by almost a third since 10 years ago, and that's a huge problem. Let me just say that this may sound easy, and I'm saying it's easy. Everybody ought to agree. But there is a lobby that doesn't agree, and they have a lot of power. You could argue that the House Ways and Means Committee for the past 6 years has been a wholly owned subsidiary of the major accounting firms. And every attempt by the Senate to crack down on cheating has been resisted in the House up till now. I don't think that's going to be the case anymore. But there is an organized tax cheaters lobby. It's financed by the banks, the accounting firms, and the lawyers who offer this kind of advice. They have front groups. One of them is called the Center for Freedom and Prosperity, a grandiose title, but I prefer to call them the Tax Cheaters Lobby because that's more intelligible. But there are a lot of people in this Senate in particular who have been leading the fight in the other direction, and that's the good news. Carl Levin and Norm Coleman over at the Investigations Subcommittee. Byron Dorgan, your colleague from North Dakota, who's been fighting against corporate offshore cheating since he came to Congress. Senator Grassley, who as Senate Finance Committee Chairman has helped expose some of these terrible abuses and proposed legislation, occasionally adopted legislation, to try to crack down on it. So these are the people you should be looking to once you give them the mandate. Do something about it. So in my testimony, I have a lot of details about going after offshore. By the way, one big piece of that, there's a lot of little things you can do, and there's two big ones. The one big one is to get these tax haven countries to disclose what's going on with our citizens. And the only way you're going to do that is to have pressure on them that, for example, if they don't disclose, our banks can't talk to them, can't send any money to them. They're out. They have to disclose. And the Cayman Islands, by the way, is worried about that enough that it's starting to think about giving us some serious disclosure. Problem in the world is, if you have one tax haven country, you're up the creek, because that's where the money will go. So we need to go after them all, and we need to get the European countries to work with us on this. They are dying to do it because they have the same problem we do. We see some of our celebrities moving their money offshore. That's the Levin Coleman hearings found 3 people that were moving billions of dollars offshore. Well, the British have the problem. The Rolling Stones and Bono have their songwriting royalties in the Netherlands, which doesn't tax royalties. Their tax rate on billions of pounds has been 2%. So we need to work with the rest of the world on this. And I see my time's up, but finally, the IRS. If you could phase in a doubling of their enforcement budget over the next 5 or 6 years, the returns would be enormous and would get us back on the right path. Maybe you need to change the budget rules. After all, if the IRS could it was treated like any other agency, it would have offsetting receipts. Okay, we spent $11 billion, our offsetting receipts, $2.2 trillion. You see what I'm saying? Why don't they get treated that way? The National Park Service gets to count the fees for going in. The National Taxpayer Advocate has suggested something along these lines that really, it's kind of wacky that you should freeze the IRS budget when it costs you 10 times or 15 times what every budget cut that you put in does. So that's my recommendations. I have a long piece of testimony, and I thank you for the opportunity to be here, and I'm sorry I went over a minute.